All right, so I'm coming back to this user model that I was using earlier in this class. One thing I want to point out, so you know how attr accessor, that's a shortcut for having to do something like def first name, first name, def set first name, or it's a shortcut for having to do all this stuff. Well, attr accessor is actually a shortcut for some shortcuts. What attr accessor actually does is it's a combination of two other things. It's a combination of attr reader, first name, last name, and attr writer, first name, last name. And so the difference is attr reader means you can look at this, it creates that getter method for you, whereas attr writer creates the setter method for you. So if I don't have attr writer in here, and I go over here and do Ruby, what is it called? Users. If I do Juan.firstName, I can get it no problem. But if I do Juan.firstName equals Steve, now it throws an error at me. Going along with that, if I change this over to having attr writer instead of attr reader, now I can do Juan.firstName equals Steve, and then that works perfectly fine. If I look at Juan.fullname, I get Steve Wanson. But if I just do Juan.firstName, it throws an error at me. So now I have a way of setting it, but not a way of getting it. Attr accessor is the exact same thing as having both of these. So attr accessor is attr reader and writer combined. I can't think of that many situations. Well, I can think of some situations in which you would use, or plenty of situations in which you would use attr reader. I can't think of very many when you would use attr writer just by itself, but it's there if you want. For the most part, though, I would say while you're getting used to this stuff, you will be perfectly fine with attr accessor. Any questions about that? Ruby's all about shortcuts, so there are shortcuts for everything. All right, we did monkeys. We talked about that. All right, so now we're going to start talking about something a little bit different. We've been talking about instance stuff, instance methods, instance variables. Now we're going to start talking about class variables. Okay, so I would like to have a way of getting all of my users. Right now, if I create a bunch of users, so I'll get rid of Juan. I'll have Alice, Allison, and Bob, Bobson. Whatever, close enough. Okay, there we go. And I run this. I would like an easy way of seeing what all my users are, but there's no way of doing that in Ruby. I can't just say like, show me all my users, and it just gives them all to me. There's no way of doing that. So here's what I'm going to do. I want you to watch what I'm doing first before you start doing it yourself. I'm going to say at all, and I'm not going to do it in initialize. So I'm breaking like two rules there. And then I'm going to say def, I'm going to call it count. I want this to count how many users I have. All dot count. And then every time, I'm sorry, this should be 0. It shouldn't be an array. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm just going to have this return at all. And then every time I do initialize, every time I do dot new, it's going to make all go up by 1. So check out what happens now. If I restart this, I can say Juan equals user.new, Juan Wanson. Steve equals user.new, Steve Stevens. If I do Juan.count, I get nothing. Oh, thank you so much. Wow, yeah, all right, take 2. Good call. Actually, before I do that, let me just do Juan.count. Steve doesn't exist yet. Do Juan.count, I get that. So now I'm going to create another user. I'm going to create Steve. If I do Juan.count now, I get 2. If I get Steve.count, I also get 2. I'm going to create a third user. I'm going to do Jorge equals user.new Jorge. And now if I do Juan.count, I get 3. If I do Steve.count, I get 3. And if I do Jorge.count, I get 3. So what I've done here is I've created a class variable. This is a class variable. That means its value is the exact same across every instance of that class. So every user is going to have the exact same at all. Every user is going to have the exact same thing for it. If I change it for one user, it's going to change for every user. This does exist in JavaScript, you just never really do it. So this is a class variable. It's a variable that has the exact same value for every single instance of a class. But I can really play with it the exact same way. I mean, I'm doing this thing right here. I don't even need that return if I don't want it. Aside from that, I can treat it the exact same way I treat everything else. The thing that's different is it has 2 @ symbols instead of just 1. And I'm going to declare it right here instead of an initialize. So there's 2 @ symbols. And I'm going to declare it here at the top of the class instead of inside initialize. So actually, this is a really good situation in which you would, if you want to get a number of all of the users. But let's do a slightly better example. So instead of this being 0, I'm going to make it an array. And now when I do user.all, I want to get every occurrence of user. So what I'm going to do is I'm introducing a new word in here, is push. And I'm going to change this to all. All right, so push is a special word in Ruby that refers to the current instance. So let me run this again. Now every time I create a new user, it's going to, it's going to put that instance of user into all. So this is going to get pretty weird. I'm going to create Steve. Oh man, this is the one where I forgot the quote. Okay. Juan equals user.new Juan Wanson. And now if I do user.all, I'm going to get, sorry, if I do steve.all, wait, no, Juan, his name was Juan. If I do Juan.all, now I get an array of all of the users I have so far. I'm going to make another user. I'm going to make Steve. Steve equals user.new Steve Stevens. And now if I do Steve.all, how many things are going to be in this array? 2, exactly. I'll have Juan and Steve inside that array. So I'll make a third one. Jorge, user.new Jorge J. Okay, whatever. So if I do Jorge.all, then I get all 3. If I do Steve.all, I get all 3. If I do whatever the other one was, I get all 3. So this is really nice if I want to keep track of all of my instances of a particular class. This, I would say, is like the biggest use case for class variables, is doing something like this. They're not used very often, but you'll see them, which is why we're going over them when you have things like this. And actually, this syntax is something you're going to see a lot later on this week, but it's going to look a little bit different, so that's what I'm going to do next. The important thing, though, is that this refers to the current instance. So I could actually change this to, instead of being @firstname, I could do self.firstname and self.lastname, and then that'll give me the exact same result. So if I do Juan equals, if I do Juan.fullname, it still gives me Juan Wanson. So the important thing here is that right now, self is equal to Juan. Self is always equal to the current instance. And that way it's like this in JavaScript. I'm breaking my JavaScript rule. Self is always equal to the current instance. So if I start doing Bob, and I do Bob.fullname, now self is equal to what? To Bob. Exactly. Now self is equal to Bob. So self is always equal to whatever comes before the period here. So now it's Bob Bobson. Self is always equal to the current instance. Questions about that? Tony?
Is there a shovel way of doing that?
What, like right here?
No, like at that push stuff.
Yeah, I could do a shovel here. I don't like the shovel. But yeah, no, this is the exact same thing. So if I start it again, one equals user dot new one Wanson, and now if I do one dot all, yep, shovel works perfectly fine. Anytime you have an array, you can use shovel on it. Doesn't matter if it's instance, class, whatever. Adrian?
Is all, could it be any word, or is it a special one?
No, it could be any word. Yep. So, I mean, this could also be fruit bat if I wanted it to be. That's just not semantically very good. I need to change this to be fruit bat everywhere else. You can have as many class variables as you want. All is not a special reserved word. All right. Other questions?
Like this, self is a word that really recognizes. So that's
Yep. Yeah, so you can't really do something like self is a reserved word. And I can tell that in Atom because whenever I type self, it changes colors. I can't do self equals, wombat. That's probably going to throw an error at me, or it's just going to like do weird stuff. Is there another hand? I thought I saw one over here. No? Okay. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do in this particular chunk is that Juan.all, that doesn't really make much sense. If I'm looking at that, then like as someone who doesn't know this code, it suggests to me that I'm trying to get all of the Juans. And that's like kind of weird because there's only one Juan. There's only Juan. So what would be a lot nicer is if I could just say all users. Instead of Juan.all, if I could do, say, user.all. And you can. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to put def user dot right here. That's all I'm going to change is just def user dot. And now this becomes a class method. So we had class variables. This is now a class method. So let me create a new Juan. If I do Juan.all, I'm not going to get anything. But if I do user.all, now I get that. So I'll make Steve as well. User.new Steve Stevens. And if I do user.all, now I get two things in there. So this makes much more sense semantically. I'm not doing Steve.all, which doesn't make any sense. I'm doing user.all. And looking at that, I get a much better cue from an English perspective that this is going to give me all users. So this is a class method. It's a method that you can call directly on the class. We've seen one other class method so far. We've seen one other user dot something. What was it? Exactly. New. New is also a class method. So somewhere deep in Ruby, there is something like def user dot new. But you never actually have to write that. That's already done for you. Questions about that?
why, I understand why you would want to do user.all, but why would it then not work anymore for if you were to type in Juan.all?
Yeah, so it's because we've explicitly said this is a class method. And so there's not really a way to do it, so you have both a class method and an instance method. I would have to define it twice. As far as Ruby is concerned, these are completely different things. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a method that's attached to the user. It's not to like the user class.
Right.
It's not attached to
No
instances.
longer attached to the but
Yep.
until you define it as that,
Mm-hmm.
or declare it as that in the function, it's everything.
Yeah, so now if I get rid of that, and I run this again, I'm going to put these guys back in here. So now I can do alice.all, and it'll give me those two. But now if I do user.all, now that's undefined. So it can be one or the other. It can be a class method or an instance method, but it can't be both. If you want both, you have to define both.
But you needed to find one. You couldn't have it. You would need the def all.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So if I want both, then I'll have that, and then I'll have def user.all, and now I can do both. So now I can do user.all, and I can do alice.all. But I don't like alice.all because I don't have multiple Alices. I just have the one. You're welcome. Other questions about that? Cool. All right, so we are creeping up on 5. The last thing I want to talk about, oh yeah, so I forgot about this. So I can actually hijack user.new. I can say like puts, haha, I've taken control of Ruby. And now if I do a new user, it's going to tell me, let me get rid of these guys. So now if I try to do Juan equals user.new, it says, haha, I've taken control of Ruby. And if I try to do something with Juan, can anyone tell me what Juan is going to be equal to? Juan's going to be equal to whatever this method returns. What does puts return? Nil. Yep. So now Juan is nil. So now I can never create a new user. I have completely destroyed users being able to do anything. I can do user.new however many times I want, and all it's going to do is laugh at me and return nil.
And if you were to try to do set something else equal to user.new, would it be there?
Oh, so if I did user.new equals.
Or let's say you you were trying to, Lexi equals user.new, whatever.
So Juan equals user.new Juan Wanson, like this thing?
Yeah.
Well, now it's going to throw an error at me because it's giving me wrong number of arguments. It's saying that this should take arguments, but even if it does, so even if I have, first and last names in here, first, last, it's still going to return nil. So even if I do that, Juan is still nil. It's still just returning whatever this is. So don't do that. All right, cool. So the very last thing I want to talk about is, and by the way, all of this stuff about classes and everything, you're going to be reviewing it tomorrow, so don't beat yourself over the head if you're feeling weird about this stuff. The last thing I want to talk about is public and private methods. So everything we've seen so far has been a public method. That is, anyone using this code that I've written can come along and do Juan.fullname. There's no problem with that. But let me make a private method. So I'm going to give this guy a password. And then I'm going to say @password equals, and I'm going to encrypt it. And now I need to define an encrypt method, so I'm going to do def encrypt. Input, and my fancy schmancy encryption method is just going to be reversing whatever the string is. Okay, so now if I do that, Juan equals user.new, Juan, Wanson, password. Now you can see his password is Drowsack. So I encrypted it. But I can also do Juan.encrypt. I don't know. I'll go back to Whortleberry. And it does it again. So this is fine, but someone who's playing around with this, they don't really need to know about that encrypt method. In fact, I may not want them to know about that encrypt method. I don't want them to see it. I don't want them to be able to do anything with it, because then they can figure out my very complicated encryption algorithm. So what I can do is this. I can just put private in front of it. Now with that done, if I run this again, Juan equals user.new, Juan, Wanson, password. I can still see that his password is there, but if I do Juan.encrypt, food, now it's undefined. Or it's not undefined, but it tells me it's a private method. So a private method is something that you can use inside an instance, but no one can access from outside an instance. And this difference between public and private, this is another thing that is constant throughout all programming languages, basically. It's important not really because this actually keeps anything private. Like anyone can come along and look at my code and know exactly what's going on. But it's more from sort of an organizational thing. It's more important for organization. So if you think about jQuery, jQuery has like 8 gazillion methods inside it. Like it has .fadeout, .css, .html, .text. It already has a whole bunch of stuff. It probably has a bunch of other methods inside it that we don't know about, that it doesn't tell us about because that would just make it even more cluttered than it already is. So this whole private-public thing, it's more useful just sort of from an organizational standpoint. An analogy for it would be like public methods, they're things your machine can do where there's a little button on the outside that says press this and I'll do whatever, like a turn signal on the car. But a private method, it's something where the machine can still do it, but there's no button for it. So that would be like the air filter in your car. It's something your machine still does that it worries about internally, but you can't like trigger it yourself. They don't want you poking around with it or playing with it. So all you have to do to make something private is just put private in front of it. Yeah, Sandra.
Does that apply to just that one method, or if you have another method below it, is it also private?
Yep, it'll apply to everything below it. So everything after this, if I put hello down here, then that is also a private method. So you should only write private once inside your class. Nope, it just keeps on going. So so your code's going to be separated into 2 chunks, public and private. So for right now, private's not really something that you need to be worried too much about because it's mostly just going to be you working on your code. But when you start working with other people who are interacting with your code, this can become really nice so that they know that they shouldn't be trying to do anything with this method. It's for internal use only. Yeah. But yeah, so it's just something to have on your radar for right now. Any questions about that? It feels like we went over a lot of stuff today. Yeah, right. All right, cool. So that's all I got. Let me just introduce the homework for tonight. And that's the Scrabble word score thing. Before I do that, if you want to review this stuff, you might go back and look at these learning objectives up here and take a look through those. And that's the stuff that you should be able to like do after this class, so it might not be a bad idea to look at that. I'll Slack out the link to this. And so this is actually a lot like Monkey, the Monkey OOP thing you did earlier, in that it has RSpec in it. So let me show you what you're going to see when you first clone this down. So I'm going to go into it. I'm going to do bundle install. It's going to do that. And now I'm going to type RSpec, and it's going to give me this error. It's going to say uninitialized constant Scrabble word. So that tells me the very first thing I need to do. Can anyone tell me what that is? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. Well, I need to define that class. So it's looking around for a class called Scrabble word, but I haven't defined Scrabble word anywhere. So that's the very first thing I'm going to do. As with the monkey thing, you shouldn't need to, there is no need to modify any files except lib Scrabble word RB. So feel free to look in them, but you don't need to do anything to them. And that's pretty much it. Any questions about that? All right, well, why don't we call it a day then? You go ahead and get started on that if you want, and I will catch you guys on the flip side.